nothing but truth on AFR Talk.
No, it's not hate. It's called accountability. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth, proudly on AFR Talk. I want to welcome those of you listening or watching or both. Washington Watch, good friend Tony Perkins, Washington Watch, the program before. And before that, of course, Pastor Bert Harper and Alex McFarland with Exploring the Word. It's great to have you all on board AFR Talk. Remember to lock it in. Now, we go to our good friend Ryan Mauro. He is the National Security Analyst for the Clarion Project, clarionproject.org. And we are discussing the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Ryan, when was the first time we talked about this?
I'm not sure exactly because it's been quite some time that since Assad's forces first began using chemical weapons on a very small level.
And in the use of these, there has always been, it seems to be a pattern with the administration, is to say we need to find out the facts. And I appreciate that. I do. I think it's important to find out who used them and who killed our ambassador, the whole thing. I really do. But when that leads to no action, it could be something domestically like the IRS and being on paid leave and taking the fifth. Bottom line, I want accountability. In the case of national security and the use of chemical weapons, I opened with that question to you because I wanted to demonstrate and show and illustrate that we've delayed this. We've delayed the consequences that we spoke to earlier. And we're dealing with Bashar Assad, not Mubarak, so we have a vicious dictator versus a dictator that was a nationalist dictator that had to go. That all said, today, John Kerry comes out and seems disappointed in the conversation he had with the Syrian representative, and that would be Syrian's Foreign Minister Walid Malayam. John Kerry does a much better job of pronouncing his name. Here is what he had to say. Roll it.
I spoke on Thursday with Syrian Foreign Minister Mualem, and I made it very clear to him that if the regime, as he argued, had nothing to hide, then their response should be immediate transparency, immediate access, not shelling. Their response needed to be unrestricted and immediate access. Failure to permit that, I told him, would tell its own story. Instead, for 5 days, the Syrian regime refused to allow the UN investigators access to the site of the attack that would allegedly exonerate them. Instead, it attacked the area further, shelling it and systematically destroying evidence. That is not the behavior of a government that has nothing to hide. That is not the action of a regime eager to prove to the world that it had not used chemical weapons. In fact, the regime's belated decision to allow access is too late, and it's too late to be credible.
Ryan, your thoughts?
Well, I've got to say that statement was great by Secretary of State John Kerry. I think it was very perfectly articulated with passion, and he really made the case that the Assad regime is being deceptive. And on top of that, what he didn't mention is that according to the reports that are out there, the U.S. did see movement at a chemical weapons facility in the area shortly before the attack, and the Israelis intercepted communications from Syrian army officers talking about using the chemical weapons, which they then shared with us. So it does seem to be a pretty tight case that the Assad regime is behind this.
When did they share that information, and what was the timeline, if you will?
That was immediately after the attack happened. And for this specific attack, the one that killed 1,500 people, the most recent one, I think that the Obama administration is operating cautiously and understandably. In the past, the Assad regime has used chemical weapons on a small scale, and then once it finally got noticed by everybody, the punishment for crossing the red line was just to give arms to the rebels, which basically gave the sign to Assad and the whole world that we so badly don't want to get involved there that we're willing to look the other way. And so now the Assad regime is using chemical weapons on a greater scale, but I do think that this time we're going to respond militarily.
Okay. Do you think that Russia and China, it seems we're making a case to the world, do you think they're going to be on board when we can prove as much as one can prove the allegation that the use of these weapons, do you think they will be on board and supportive of military action?
There's no doubt that they're going to oppose it. It looks like, ironically enough, the Obama administration isn't even going to go to the UN about this, that this is going to be a NATO intervention done with France and England, and it's going to be limited cruise missile strikes that are just aimed at punishing the military forces that carry out the attack. There may be some attacks on air bases and some other delivery mechanisms that they use in order to deliver the chemical weapons. But I don't think they are going to see something like in Libya, at least not right now, unless it spirals out of control. The intention right now is just to strike a very limited number of targets.
It seems to me, and I spoke in the intro about this, that would be symbolic. And symbolic military gestures don't move dictators. And in fact, they just actually give more propaganda to the dictator who says, look, they're fighting us, and we need to stay in power so that we don't have the West coming in like they're doing. That will help having China and Russia there. My point is, why not decapitate the regime? Or if you're going to do something militarily, have an outcome that you can measure that shows there is a way that you have moved the ball forward and dealt a serious blow to those willing to use these weapons.
Well, I think that this is mostly about U.S. credibility, that we have to do something painful to the Assad regime in order to show that we mean business and that they better not use chemical weapons again. And so the problem is that if we start decapitating the regime, then the outcome we're trying to avoid, which is the use of chemical weapons, is something that we end up guaranteeing. Because if Assad's on his way out, he might as well try to use the weapons. So it's a very delicate situation, and the reason that I don't support decapitating the regime right now, even though I support some limited action, is simply because of the organization of the rebels. We have not given enough assistance to the moderate elements of the Free Syrian Army, those are the rebels, to overpower al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the other Islamists on the ground. And we don't want the Islamists controlling any part of Syria, and that's what's going to happen if we decapitate the regime.
Well said. The question, you've done some great work in identifying through the Free Syrian Army the elements that do stand with people who desire to be free. And you've spoken to the possibility of al-Qaeda elements and other terrorist elements being a part of that. If what I'm getting you're suggesting is you don't support decapitating the regime right now because that will lead to more use of these weapons. We don't have an outcome that we can guarantee one way or another of who's in power, so we may just be putting in power Islamists, al-Qaeda. So are you saying that maybe we start with something right now, but we start having a policy that truly outlines and identifies the leaders that you have identified in the Free Syrian Army and the like?
Yeah, yes, definitely. I mean, I want to see Assad go just as much as anyone else, but I want that to happen in a way that is done intelligently and that doesn't make the situation dramatically worse. And I think no matter what we do, the situation is going to get dramatically worse, and this is just about containing how bad it's going to be. I think that if you look at the scale of death right now in Syria, this is going to look like the good old days compared to what's to come.
That's, well, deeply troubling as so many things are. You have spoken to the WMD in the past in your journalistic career and covering, and never going so far as to say, here's where they are. You've been reporting, which is always responsible, and that's why we appreciate you. My question is, where did Bashar Assad, where did the regime get these weapons?
Well, a lot of them were from Russia and from third world countries. Syria has had its own WMD stockpile since at least the early 1980s to the late 1970s. So they've had their own stockpiles, but what you're alluding to is the theory that some of Iraq's WMD stockpiles, the technology, the expertise, made its way to Syria. And that's something I've documented time and time again, that I think that there is a very strong, albeit circumstantial, case that you can make that transfer occurred. Was it the huge amount of stockpiles that we thought Saddam Hussein had? No, there would be more evidence that that was the case. But I do think you had technology and expertise and possibly a small stockpile go from Saddam Hussein's regime to Syria.
How does this play out between not only the Syrian regime and the inter-battle between in essence, a civil war, but between Russia, China, and the United States? How does this factor in? And do you see Russians continuing to provide support for Syria, Bashar Assad's regime?
They are providing support for Bashar Assad's regime because Russia views Syria right now basically as an entire base. They have a major naval base there, but they view Assad as an important geopolitical ally, and so they don't want to see him go. However, once it becomes clear that he is going to go, I think that they're going to jump ship, and I base that on the fact that once it looked like the rebels had serious momentum on the ground, the Russians evacuated their staff from their naval base, and then they leased another naval base nearby at Cyprus to replace it. So they were preparing for the day that the Assad regime was going to go down. And, of course, they didn't announce it because they didn't want anyone to see that.